Imagine this, the man you hated most in your life, the one who abandoned you when you needed him the most, is now at your doorstep, begging for help. A billionaire who once had it all and lost everything, now on his knees, pleading with the one person he ignored his entire life, you. This is the story of Theodore, a man who faced abandonment, built his life from the ground up, and now confronts the most unexpected twist of his existence. What would you do in his shoes? Theodore was only 8 years old when his life took its first major turn. He grew up in a small town in rural Texas, in a modest home filled with love, or so he thought. His father, Bernard, an ambitious but emotionally distant man, was always absent. When he was around, he made a point to be an imposing figure, full of promises about a brighter future. But those promises were just empty words. One morning, as Theodore struggled to finish the breakfast his mother insisted on making to cheer him up before school, Bernard simply walked out. No warnings, no goodbyes. He left with just a suitcase, abandoning a broken family in his wake. Theodore never saw that man again, not as a father, at least. His mother, Sarah, became the rock of the family. She worked tirelessly to raise Theodore and his younger sister, Ellie. But Bernard's absence left deep scars, especially on Theodore. He grew up consumed by a mix of anger and sadness, always wondering what he had done to make his father leave. "It wasn't you, Theo," Sarah would tell him. But Theodore could never fully believe it. While Theodore wrestled with his emotional storm, Bernard was building a luxurious life far away. He moved to California, started a tech company that skyrocketed in success, and soon became one of the wealthiest men in the state. Mansions, sports cars, lavish parties, they were all part of Bernard's world. For Theodore, however, Bernard was nothing more than a name he avoided saying aloud, a shadow in his memory that he tried, unsuccessfully, to erase. Years later, as an adult working as a mechanic in a small auto shop, Theodore's life took an unexpected turn. One afternoon, while inspecting a car, his phone rang with a number he didn't recognize. On the other end was a voice, weary and desperate, murmuring, "Theo, I need you. It's your father." Theodore froze. The words echoed like they'd come from a ghost. Bernard, the man who had walked away without a backward glance, was now asking for help. But Theodore didn't yet know that what he was about to uncover was far bigger than the pain he had carried for years. Theodore spent the rest of the day trying to ignore the call, but Bernard's voice wouldn't leave his mind. "I need you." It was as though those words were etched into every sound in the shop, the hum of engines, the clang of tools against metal. By the time he locked up for the day, Theodore found himself driving aimlessly. Anger and curiosity waged war inside him, and for the first time in years, he let himself think about the man who had wrecked his childhood. When he arrived home, Sarah was sitting on the porch, her expression calm and steady, a stark contrast to the turmoil Theodore felt. "Mom," he called, he blurted out. Sarah put down her teacup and looked at him with a mix of surprise and apprehension. "Who?" she asked, though deep down, she already knew the answer. "My father. He said he needs me." The silence that followed was heavy, and Theodore saw in her eyes the same conflict raging in his own mind. "And what are you going to do?" Sarah finally asked softly. Theodore didn't respond, but he knew that question would haunt him. That night, sleep eluded him. He tossed and turned, grappling with the thought of what Bernard wanted from him. Money? A place to stay? Forgiveness? The idea of helping that man made his stomach turn, yet something in Bernard's voice lingered in his mind. It wasn't arrogance or entitlement, as Theodore had imagined. It was fear. Fear and desperation. But why? The next day, needing answers, Theodore called back the unknown number. Bernard answered almost instantly, as though he'd been waiting. "Theo, thank you for calling me back. I know I don't deserve this, but," Bernard's voice cracked. Theodore, his tone cold, interrupted, "Just tell me what you want." The pause on the other end was long before Bernard finally admitted, "I'm sick. I don't have much time left. And I have no one." For a moment, Theodore couldn't speak. Sick. That was why. A flood of emotions washed over him, anger, pity, and even a strange sense of relief. But Bernard wasn't done. "I've lost everything, Theo. My business, my fortune, it's all gone. And now, you're all I have left." Those words hit Theodore like a punch to the gut. He hung up without responding. The thought that the man who had abandoned him now depended on him was almost too much to process. As he drove through the city, trying to make sense of it all, a childhood memory surfaced, the day he fell off his bike and waited for hours for his father, who never came to help. The feeling of being invisible, of not mattering, was as vivid as ever. But now, the roles were reversed. Bernard was the one who had fallen, waiting for someone to help him. And Theodore held the power to decide his father's fate. Theodore spent the next few days in a haze of confusion, anger, and self-reflection. The memory of Bernard's voice, weak and pleading, clashed with every painful moment from his childhood, the missed birthdays, the empty promises, the silence that followed Bernard's departure. Every fiber of his being wanted to slam the door on the past and let Bernard deal with the consequences of his choices. But something wouldn't let him. One evening, Sarah found Theodore sitting on the back porch, staring into the dark sky. She quietly joined him, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You've been quiet," she said softly, her tone inviting but not probing. Theodore sighed deeply. "I don't know what to do, Mom. He's sick. He says he has no one." Sarah nodded, her expression thoughtful. "And how does that make you feel?" she asked, her voice calm but laced with the wisdom of someone who had faced her own share of hard choices. Theodore ran a hand through his hair, his frustration evident. "It makes me angry. And guilty. I don't even know why I care. He abandoned us. Why should I help him now?" Sarah stayed silent for a moment, then spoke with measured words. "Theo, you don't have to forgive him. And you don't owe him anything. But sometimes, doing the right thing isn't about the other person, it's about you. Carrying anger for so long, it weighs on you. Maybe this is your chance to let some of that go." Her words struck a chord, though Theodore wasn't ready to admit it. He didn't respond, but he didn't dismiss them either. The next morning, Theodore found himself sitting in his truck outside a rundown motel on the edge of town. He had reluctantly agreed to meet Bernard, more out of a need for closure than anything else. As he sat there, staring at the peeling paint and broken neon sign, he wondered if this was a mistake. But before he could second-guess himself again, the door to one of the rooms opened, and Bernard stepped out. The man who approached Theodore was a shadow of the person he remembered from faded photographs and distant memories. Bernard's once pristine suits were replaced with wrinkled, ill-fitting clothes. His confident stride was now a hesitant shuffle. And his face, once full of sharp arrogance, was lined with exhaustion and regret. "Thank you for coming," Bernard said, his voice hoarse, as he stood awkwardly a few feet away from Theodore's truck. Theodore didn't reply immediately. He studied the man before him, searching for a trace of the father he once knew, but all he saw was a stranger. "What do you want from me?" Theodore finally asked, his tone guarded. Bernard hesitated, as though weighing his words carefully. "I know I have no right to ask you for anything," he began, his eyes filled with a vulnerability that caught Theodore off guard. "I've made mistakes, more than I can count. But now I just need someone to listen. Someone to care. And you're the only person I have left." Theodore scoffed, bitterness seeping into his words. "You've got a lot of nerve, showing up after all these years and expecting sympathy. Do you even know what you did to us? To me? You ruined our lives." Bernard flinched at the harshness of Theodore's words, but he didn't argue. "You're right," he said quietly. "I ruined everything. I thought I was chasing success, building a better future for myself, but I lost sight of what really mattered. And by the time I realized it, it was too late. Theodore felt a surge of conflicting emotions, anger, pity, and something he couldn't quite name. He wanted to lash out, to make Bernard feel even a fraction of the pain he had endured. But looking at the frail man before him, it was clear that life had already dealt Bernard more punishment than Theodore ever could. "I don't know if I can help you," Theodore said after a long pause. "But I'll listen. For now." Bernard's shoulders sagged with relief, and for the first time, Theodore saw something genuine in his father's expression: gratitude. It wasn't forgiveness, and it wasn't reconciliation. But it was a start. Over the next few weeks, Theodore and Bernard began to navigate the fragile terrain of their fractured relationship. Bernard shared stories of his rise to fortune, the choices he regretted, and the loneliness that had consumed him after losing everything. Theodore, in turn, spoke of the years of anger and abandonment, the struggles he faced growing up, and the walls he had built to protect himself. It wasn't easy. The wounds ran deep, and there were moments when Theodore felt like walking away. But with each conversation, he began to see Bernard not as the towering figure who had loomed over his childhood, but as a flawed, broken man. One day, as they sat together on the porch of Sarah's house, Bernard looked at Theodore with a seriousness that made him pause. "I don't have much time left, Theo," he said softly. "But I want you to know. I'm proud of you. I know I didn't earn the right to say that, but it's the truth." Theodore didn't respond immediately. He stared out at the horizon, the weight of Bernard's words settling over him. "You're right," he said finally. "You didn't earn it. But I'll take it." In that moment, Theodore realized that helping Bernard wasn't about absolving him. It was about freeing himself from the anger, the bitterness, and the pain that had defined so much of his life. And for the first time, he felt lighter. Not because the past was forgotten, but because he had finally taken control of his future. Theodore spent the entire day wrestling with the emotions that Bernard's call had unearthed, but it felt like trying to hold back a tidal wave. The news that his father was ill echoed relentlessly in his mind, stirring up old memories and a whirlwind of questions. At the same time, pride and anger fought to silence those thoughts, just as they always had. Yet that evening, as he closed the shop and sat in his car, Theodore felt something different. The emptiness of decades past seemed to shift into something unrecognizable. Without realizing it, he started driving. The streets of his small town, usually so familiar, now felt longer, almost foreign. Theodore had no destination in mind, but when he stopped the car, he found himself in front of the hospital. He stared at the illuminated building, its cold, impersonal lights reflecting the heaviness in his chest. He didn't want to be there, but he knew avoiding it wouldn't solve anything. Taking a deep breath, he stepped out of the car and walked to the entrance, each step weighed down by anxiety and anger that seemed to constrict his throat. "Room 214, the receptionist told him. Theodore climbed the 2 flights of stairs as if carrying a heavy load. When he reached the door, it was slightly ajar, and he could hear the faint sound of a television in the background. For a moment, he considered turning back. But something pushed him forward. There he was, Bernard. The man Theodore hadn't seen in over 20 years now looked like a complete stranger. Sitting on the hospital bed, connected to 4 lines, with a distant look in his eyes, Bernard's pale, almost translucent skin and slumped shoulders made him seem like a shadow of his former self. The sterile smell of disinfectant mixed with the scent of medication hung in the air, making the scene even more suffocating. When Bernard lifted his eyes and saw Theodore, his expression changed. First, it was surprise, then, a wave of emotion washed over him. Tears filled his eyes almost instantly as he tried to speak, but no words came out. Theodore crossed his arms, standing stiffly in the doorway. He had imagined this moment so many times, how he would confront Bernard, what he would say. But now, face to face with the man, he felt a strange emptiness, unable to find the words he had rehearsed for years. "You came," Bernard murmured, his voice hoarse and frail, as though it had taken all his strength just to say those words. "I didn't think you'd show up." Theodore's gaze was icy. "Why would I? What do you want from me?" His voice was sharp and emotionless, but inside, he was a storm of conflicting feelings. Bernard sighed and lowered his eyes, as though crushed by the weight of his own guilt. It took him several moments to respond, each second stretching into eternity. "I need you, Theo. I'm sick. I don't know how much time I have left, and I need to make things right." He looked up again, his eyes filled with a sincerity that Theodore didn't know whether to trust. "I messed up. With you, with your mother, with Ellie. But now, I have nothing left. Only you." The silence that followed was heavier than Bernard's words. Theodore looked away, his eyes fixed on the hospital room window as though searching for an escape. He wanted to shout, to unload decades of pain and resentment on this man, but for some reason, he couldn't. All he could think was, why now? Theodore turned his gaze back to his father, searching for something, anything, that would justify staying. Bernard looked so small, so defeated. The man he had hated for most of his life now seemed like a broken reflection of who he once was. And despite everything, a part of Theodore began to waver. Maybe it was Bernard's exhausted expression or the gravity of the moment, but he knew he couldn't ignore what was in front of him forever. Make things right? Theodore finally broke the silence, letting out a bitter laugh. You think you can fix 20 years in a few months? You think you can just show up like nothing happened and expect me to save you? His words came out in a rush, fueled by anger but also something deeper, pain, maybe doubt. Bernard lowered his head again, unable to respond. For a moment, the room was filled only with the hum of the medical equipment. Theodore felt a strange twist inside himself. He turned and left the hospital, his footsteps heavy. Each step felt harder than the last, as though the air around him had thickened. The conversation replayed in his mind on a loop, every word, every expression. He couldn't shake the image of Bernard's face, etched with more than guilt. It carried regret and a silent plea, something Theodore wasn't ready to process. He got into his car and started the engine but didn't drive off right away. He sat there, gripping the steering wheel, replaying the moment he had walked into that hospital room. Why had he gone? Why hadn't he just ignored the call, like he had ignored every thought of his father for decades? He felt foolish, as if he had fallen into an emotional trap he'd spent his life avoiding. Yet something in Bernard's voice kept nagging at him. What if he really was sorry? What if this time was different? Back at the shop the next day, Theodore tried to lose himself in his work. He grabbed his tools and started working on an engine, but his hands trembled. He had always been able to focus, no matter what, but now it felt impossible. As he tightened bolts on the engine, flashes of his childhood came flooding back. He remembered the time he won a science fair at 10 years old, waiting for hours at the presentation, hoping Bernard would show up. He remembered the ache of realizing his father never would. That same emptiness now returned, but in a far more confusing way. "You all right, Theo?" one of his co-workers asked. Theodore looked up, realizing he had been gripping a wrench so tightly it had nearly bent. He sighed, wiped the sweat from his brow, and nodded silently, trying to shake the memories. But they only came back stronger. By the end of the day, Theodore knew he couldn't just leave things unresolved. He needed answers. He couldn't let Bernard back into his life so easily, but he also couldn't walk away without understanding why. Why had Bernard left? Why hadn't he come back? And most importantly, why now? That night, Theodore sat with his mother, Sarah, at the small kitchen table of their home. The house hadn't changed much since his childhood, simple, worn furniture filled with memories. Sarah looked tired but carried the same quiet strength that had always held their family together. She seemed to know what Theodore wanted to ask before he even spoke. He's sick, Mom, Theodore began, breaking the silence. Sarah looked away, stirring her tea as if trying to avoid the conversation. I know you don't like talking about him, but why did he leave? Really? What happened? Sarah let out a deep sigh and stayed quiet for a few moments, staring into her cup as though the answers were hidden at the bottom. Your father was always a complicated man, Theo. Too ambitious for his own good. He wanted more than he could handle, and I think, we didn't fit into his plans. Her voice was steady but laced with a sadness she had carried for years. When he left, I thought he'd come back. I thought he'd realize he made a mistake. But he never did. Theodore clenched his fists on the table. He knew there was more to the story, but Sarah seemed hesitant to say it. Mom, I need to know. He's saying he wants to make things right, but how can I believe him if I don't even know what he really did? He hated pushing her, but his need for answers outweighed his caution. Sarah looked up at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of love and pain. Theo, sometimes the answers won't give you peace. I carried this hurt for years, but I learned to let it go. You can, too. Don't let him drag you back into his past. Her words left Theodore more conflicted than ever. Was she right? Or did he need to confront Bernard to finally move on? He knew the next step would be meeting Bernard again, but this time, he needed to be ready to demand the truth. Deep down, he felt Bernard was hiding more than he had admitted. And Theodore had to find out what it was. The next day, Theodore returned to the hospital, but this time with a purpose. He wasn't there to hear Bernard's apologies or witness his frailty. He wanted answers, clear, straightforward ones. Something inside him whispered that there was more to the story than Bernard was willing to admit. If Bernard truly wanted to fix things, he would have to start with the truth. As Theodore entered the room, he saw Bernard staring out the window, his eyes fixed on a distant point as if lost somewhere in the past. The sound of the door opening made him turn slowly. You came back, Bernard murmured, his voice tinged with surprise and hope. But Theodore had no interest in sentimentality. Crossing his arms, he stood firm, staring at his father with a cold, unwavering gaze. Don't start with that, Theodore said sharply. I want answers. You owe me, my mother, and Ellie that much. Why did you leave? What really happened? His voice was firm, though a flicker of emotion betrayed the storm inside him. Bernard looked away, seemingly searching for the courage to respond. I made mistakes, Theo, Bernard began, but Theodore cut him off. I'm not here for generic apologies. I want to know why. What was so important that it made you abandon your family? He stepped forward, his tone growing more forceful. You want to fix things? Start by telling me the truth. Bernard took a deep breath, running a hand over his face. He looked more exhausted than ever, as though the weight of his past had finally become too heavy to bear. I always wanted more, he admitted at last. More than that small town could offer. More than I thought you, your mother, or Ellie could give me. When I got an offer to work in California, I saw it as my chance to change my life. But I knew it would be a permanent change. Permanent? Theodore repeated, his voice a mixture of disbelief and anger. You decided your family was a burden? That it would be easier to just erase us from your life? Bernard flinched as if Theodore's words had struck him physically. That's not how I saw it at the time, Bernard said quietly. I thought I was doing the right thing. That I could send money, that you would be better off without me. Better off without you? Theodore scoffed bitterly. Do you have any idea what your leaving did to us? The struggles Mom faced to keep us afloat? How you shattered everything we believed in? He paused, taking a deep breath, trying to keep the anger threatening to spill over in check. Bernard remained silent for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was heavy with regret. I was selfish. I thought I could justify my choices with the success I was chasing. But in the end, the success didn't mean anything. I made money, gained status, but lost everything that mattered. He looked up at Theodore, his eyes glistening with unexpected tears. I lost you. The silence that followed was deafening. Theodore felt a whirlwind of emotions, each one pulling him in a different direction. Part of him wanted to believe his father was being genuine. Another part was weighed down by the pain of old memories, refusing to let go of the past. And now what? Theodore said, his voice sharp. You want forgiveness? You expect me to just forget everything and take care of you? The words came out harsher than he intended, but he couldn't help it. I don't expect you to forgive me, Bernard said softly, his voice weak. If I were in your position, I probably never would. But I needed to see you. I needed to say, that I'm sorry for everything. And if you'll let me, I'd like to at least get to know you. To know the man you've become. Those words echoed in Theodore's mind. He studied Bernard, trying to discern whether his tone held sincerity or if this was yet another attempt at manipulation. One thing Theodore knew for sure was that nothing about this situation would be easy from here on out. Theodore exhaled deeply, his mind spinning. He wanted to walk away, to leave Bernard and his regrets behind. But something, perhaps the raw vulnerability in Bernard's voice or the undeniable fact that the man before him looked truly broken, kept him rooted in place. Whatever decision Theodore made, it would change everything. And for the first time in years, he felt the weight of a choice that was entirely his to make. Theodore left the hospital feeling heavier than when he arrived. The conversation with Bernard had shaken him in ways he hadn't anticipated. His father's words, his vulnerability, and even his apologies echoed in Theodore's mind, tangled with memories he had spent years trying to bury. He drove home in silence, gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. When he pulled into the driveway, he saw Ellie sitting on the porch, a cup of coffee cradled in her hands. His younger sister, always serene and introspective, looked up and frowned as she caught his expression. What happened? She asked before he even stepped onto the porch. Theodore sank into the chair beside her, running his hands over his face, searching for the right words. I went to see Dad, he finally said, his voice heavy. Even saying the words felt strange, as if they didn't belong to him. Ellie froze, staring at him in disbelief. You went to see him? Why? He called, Theodore explained, his tone weary. Said he's sick. Said he doesn't have anyone else. He wanted to talk to me, and I needed answers. Ellie sat silently for a moment, her fingers gripping her coffee cup tightly. Did you get them? She asked, her voice tinged with curiosity but also something deeper, hurt, maybe even fear. Theodore shrugged. He said he was chasing success. Thought he was doing what was best for us by staying away and sending money. But in the end, he was just thinking about himself. Ellie let out a bitter laugh, short and sharp. Of course, he was. He always thought about himself first. And now, when he's got nothing and no one, he thinks he can come back and get forgiveness. She tried to mask her emotions, but Theodore knew his sister well enough to see the pain beneath her anger. I don't know what to think, Ellie, Theodore admitted after a long pause. Part of me hates him, hates everything he put us through. But, seeing him now, he just seems so broken. I don't know if I can ignore that. Ellie turned to him, her eyes glistening with a mix of tears and frustration. Theo, he wasn't there when we needed him. He didn't see what Mom went through, didn't see how you gave up so much to help us. He doesn't know who we are. And now he wants to fix everything. I can't. Her voice cracked at the end, and Theodore reached over, placing a hand on her shoulder. I don't know if I can either, he said honestly. But I had to hear him out. I needed to understand why he did what he did. Ellie didn't respond right away. She stared off into the distance, her gaze fixed on the stars beginning to appear in the evening sky. "Did you find what you were looking for?" she finally asked. Theodore was silent because the truth was, he didn't know. The next morning, Theodore woke up before dawn. He hadn't slept much. Every time he closed his eyes, Bernard's tired face haunted him. His father's words echoed in his head, "I only have you." But what if it was just another manipulation? Theodore didn't trust him. The doubt gnawed at him like an unhealed wound. Without telling anyone, he got into his car and drove to the shop. Instead of going inside, he sat in the parking lot, staring blankly ahead. What did Bernard really want? Redemption? Or was this just a way to soothe his wounded ego? His phone buzzed, breaking the silence. It was a message from Sarah. "Theo, can we talk about your father?" He hesitated before responding. Sarah rarely mentioned Bernard, even less so voluntarily. Something about the message unsettled him. Deciding it couldn't wait, he drove to her house. When he arrived, Sarah was in the kitchen, busy with simple tasks, as if they were her way of finding peace. She greeted him with a faint smile, but there was something different in her expression, something Theodore couldn't quite place. "Sit down," she said, setting 2 cups of coffee on the table. He obeyed, waiting for her to speak. "I heard Ellie mention that you two talked," Sarah began, stirring her coffee absently. "I know this must be hard for you. But there's something I need to tell you, Theo. Something you might not know." Theodore frowned, his heart beginning to race. "What is it?" he asked cautiously. Sarah took a deep breath, as if summoning her courage. "When your father left, he left a letter. I never showed it to you or Ellie because, at the time, I didn't think it would help. But now, I think it's time." The air grew heavier. "A letter?" Theodore asked, his voice tight. "Why didn't you tell us about it?" "Because I didn't think it mattered," Sarah said firmly, though her tone carried a hint of guilt. "In the letter, he said he wasn't ready to be a father. That the life we had felt too small for him. He said he loved us but didn't know how to reconcile that with his need to leave." The anger Theodore thought he had buried flared up again. "So, he loved us, but not enough to stay. He wrote a letter to justify abandoning us and thought that made it okay." Sarah looked at him with sadness. "I'm not defending what he did, Theo. I just thought you deserved to know. He wasn't a bad man. He was a weak one. And now, from what you've told me, it sounds like he's finally trying to face the weight of his choices." Theodore stared down at his coffee cup, unsure what to feel. Was it better or worse that Bernard had left those words behind? He couldn't decide. Before he could respond, Sarah stood and walked to a drawer. She returned with an aged envelope, placing it gently on the table and sliding it toward him. "Read it," she said softly. "And then decide what you want to do." Theodore hesitated before picking up the envelope. The feel of the worn paper was oddly heavy in his hands. He didn't know if he wanted to open it or burn it. But he knew that, one way or another, that letter could change everything. He slipped it into his pocket and gave his mother a quick hug before leaving. He needed time to process. As he drove to the hospital, his mind was a storm of thoughts. The letter was a key to a past he had tried so hard to bury. But did he really want to unlock that door? What if Bernard's words were as empty as the promises he had made years ago? Parking his car outside the hospital, Theodore sat for a long moment, staring at the building. He knew he needed to go in, but for the first time, he hesitated. Theodore held the envelope as if it were made of something far heavier than paper. The silence inside the car seemed to amplify the flood of thoughts rushing through his mind. Sarah's words echoed, "Read it, and then decide what to do with it." With trembling fingers, he opened the envelope, the scent of old paper rising faintly. Inside was a carefully folded piece of paper. Unfolding it, the sight of Bernard's handwriting made Theodore's heart race. Taking a deep breath, he began to read, "Theo, if you're reading this, it means I had the courage to leave this letter, but not the strength to stay. I know you won't understand this now, maybe you never will, but I need you to know my leaving wasn't about you. It wasn't about Ellie or your mother. It was about me. About the inability I've always felt to be enough for you. I saw myself as a burden, a man constantly chasing something greater, even when I already had everything. It was selfish. I have no excuse for that. When you look at me, you see a father. But, Theo, I never knew how to be one. Every mistake I made was an attempt to find myself, to prove myself. I thought the only way to do that was to leave, to build something that felt worthwhile. But what did I leave behind? You, Ellie, and Sarah. I left you with wounds I should have healed, not caused. I don't know if I'll ever be able to fix what I've done. Maybe I'll never get that chance. But know this, if I could go back in time, I'd do everything differently. I would have stayed. Because the success I chased never brought me the peace I thought it would. All it did was take me further from the only people who mattered. I hope one day you can forgive me, not for me, but for yourself. So the anger I caused doesn't consume everything you are. Because, Theo, you are a better man than I ever was. Theodore's hands were shaking as he finished reading. He read the letter a second time, then a third, searching for something between the lines. It wasn't a perfect letter. It wasn't an acceptable justification. But it was something, more than he ever expected from Bernard. And that unsettled him. Without thinking, Theodore stepped out of the car and walked into the hospital. The bright lights and the sterile smell enveloped him, but this time, he didn't hesitate. He climbed the stairs quickly and opened Bernard's door without knocking. His father sat on the bed, staring into the void. When Bernard saw Theodore enter, his head lifted, and his eyes looked even more sunken, more exhausted. I read the letter, Theodore said bluntly. Bernard froze, as though he had been waiting for a final verdict. You left it with my mom when you walked out. Don't you think that was something I should have gotten sooner? His voice was firm, but there was something different now, less anger, more pain. Bernard dropped his gaze, shame written across his face. I thought it would be easier for you to hate me. That I was just a burden. I didn't know how to stay, Theo. I didn't know how to face what I'd done. And now you think you do? Theodore asked, moving closer. He pulled a chair over and sat beside the bed, meeting his father's gaze. You're here now, asking me for help. Telling me you want to fix things. But how am I supposed to believe you? How can I trust a man who's always run away? I don't expect you to believe me, Bernard replied, his voice faint. I only hope you'll give me a chance to try. Not for me. For you. He paused, his breath labored. I know you carry a weight because of me. And if I can lighten it, even just a little, then it's worth it. Theodore studied his father for a long moment, saying nothing. He knew there was no simple resolution to this. The anger he carried wouldn't dissolve with a letter or remorseful words. But for the first time, he realized that maybe, just maybe, that anger wasn't something he wanted to carry forever. Theodore remained silent for a few minutes, staring at the man in front of him. Bernard, once an imposing figure who seemed untouchable, now sat before him as a broken, vulnerable man, clinging to what little was left of his life. The words from the letter echoed in Theodore's mind, alongside memories of a childhood defined by absence and emptiness. The weight of the moment bore down on him, as if he were holding not just Bernard's future in his hands, but his own as well. I don't know what you expect from me, Theodore said, finally breaking the silence. His voice was calm but resolute. You talk about fixing things, but that won't erase what happened. It won't bring back the years you took from me, from Mom, from Ellie. Bernard nodded, his gaze lowered, as though each word was a deserved blow. I know, he whispered, his voice barely audible. And that's what hurts the most, knowing the time I lost can never be recovered. Theodore took a deep breath, the anger and sadness battling for space within him. I spent years trying to hate you. And, to be honest, for a long time, it was easy. But now that I'm here, now that I see you like this, he hesitated, the words catching in his throat. I don't know if I can anymore. Bernard looked up, startled, but said nothing. Theodore continued, his voice growing steadier. What you did was unforgivable. You left us. You betrayed us. But I've realized that if I keep holding on to this anger, you'll keep controlling me, even if you don't mean to. And I won't let that happen. A heavy silence filled the room. Bernard seemed to struggle to speak, but no words came out. Theodore rose from his chair, fixing his gaze on his father one last time. I don't know if I'll ever forgive you completely. But I also won't let you be the weight that holds me back. He turned to leave, but Bernard, with visible effort, called after him. Theo, his voice was weak, but there was something in it that made Theodore pause. He turned around to see Bernard looking straight at him. Thank you, for giving me this chance. Even if I don't deserve it. Theodore didn't respond. He simply nodded and walked out of the room with firm steps, though his heart still felt heavy. In the hallway, he stopped for a moment, feeling the world spin around him. He knew he had made the right decision for himself, but that didn't make it any easier. Total forgiveness might never come, but in that moment, he realized he was beginning to loosen the chains that had bound him to the past. Back in his car, Theodore felt the first glimmer of relief he'd had in years. The pain was still there, but it no longer felt suffocating. He glanced at the hospital in his rearview mirror, took a deep breath, and started the engine. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time, he felt he had control over his own life. Whatever Bernard had done in the past no longer defined Theodore. What mattered now was what he chose to do moving forward. And he chose to move on. If you enjoyed this moving story, don't forget to leave a like and check out our next videos. One's already popping up on your screen now. See you there.